Friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This Before You Read lecture is on the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel. As with the previous lectures on the prophets, I'll do my best to give you a sense of the persona as well as the message of Ezekiel. When I'm thinking about Ezekiel, I'm reminded of that parable that Jesus says about putting new wine in old wineskins. And that if you do so, actually both will be ruined. That the new wine cannot be placed in old wineskins. The old wineskins simply cannot hold that which is new. Ezekiel, as a prophet writing in and during the Babylonian exile, has a similar message for the people of God. The new thing that God wants to do with Jerusalem and with the institutions of the priesthood and even the kingship must be entirely undone in order for something new to come about. That, I think, is a good place for us to start our thinking about Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel is written by Ezekiel, a priest who experienced his first vision of God, his commissioning, if you will, from exile, from Babylon, not even in the land of God. There are numerous date formulae throughout the book of Ezekiel that give us many more clues about when Ezekiel was written, or at least when Ezekiel was active as a prophet. Based on these date formulae, we can be relatively confident that Ezekiel was active from roughly 593 BCE, when he was commissioned as a prophet, until at least 571 BC. There is no mention of Cyrus, the king of Persia, who will eventually defeat the Babylonians and allow the people of Israel to return to the land. And so because of this, it's likely that Ezekiel ended his prophetic ministry before Cyrus's rise to power. Another notable thing about the book of Ezekiel itself is that it is more structured than some of the other prophetic writings that we've encountered. You'll remember that many of the prophetic writings consist of prophetic oracles or utterances that are loosely strung together, that have some broad or maybe not so clear structure chronologically or thematically. But Ezekiel gives us a little bit more structure. Chapters 1 through 11 really describe the departure of God's glory from Jerusalem. That's really the sort of the bulk of chapters 1 through 11. In chapters 12 through 24, God essentially lays out the case that God has against God's people. These are the oracles of judgment against the people of God. Then in chapters 25 through 32, there are oracles against other nations, like we've seen, for example, in Amos and Isaiah. Then in chapters 33 through 48, Ezekiel's message takes a turn toward one of consolation and future restoration. Again, the newness is promised, but only after that which is old has been replaced. You will recall from earlier that Ezekiel is a priest, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that the book of Ezekiel itself betrays a greater interest in matters related to the priesthood and the temple. Much like the priestly code of Leviticus, Ezekiel does not distinguish between so-called moral and ritual laws. The defilement that Ezekiel is concerned with is both a matter of how they worship and how they live. Ezekiel seems to suggest that it is the impurity of the city itself that has been the cause of Jerusalem's downfall. And in chapters 40 through 48, we get this long description, a measuring even, of the new Jerusalem temple and the variety of religious ceremonies that will take place there. It's very similar to what we've seen in Leviticus and Exodus. One part of Ezekiel's persona that I think will stand out to you as you read Ezekiel is that Ezekiel often embodies his message. He wears his message. His body is the message. He is the show and tell prophet. Frequently, Ezekiel's message carries with it a powerful, even strange set of symbolic actions. He lies on one side for a number of days and then lies on another side to signify to Jerusalem its future encampment. He digs a hole in a wall. He is the prophet of idiosyncratic actions. And it sort of betrays the reality that many of his symbolic actions are not what we would associate with a quote-unquote well-adjusted person. In many ways, his message and his manner of delivering that message breaks expectations. Throughout, there are some tasks that Ezekiel is trying to do with his message. He's trying to indicate the end of these institutions that the people of God have come to love and trust, including the institution of the temple and the kingship. He's preparing for and responding to the destruction of Jerusalem, which will itself be a traumatic event. And he's declaring the end of the people of God's relationship with the Lord's land. In so many ways, Ezekiel, like Jeremiah, is responding to the trauma of exile. One of the major themes in Ezekiel concerns the glory of God. God's glory is a theme at the beginning and especially at the end, almost as a bookend to what Ezekiel is declaring. God's glory is said to depart from the Jerusalem temple in the first part of the book, and then it returns in the last part. Again, when that which is old has been disrupted and destroyed, God can come to inhabit a new temple. God's glory is tied to holiness. Remember that God's glory, God's weight, God's character can't dwell in impurity, according to Leviticus and other priestly writers. And so it is impurity, both moral and ritual, that essentially evacuates God from the city in the temple. And so because of that, there is this newness that comes through the tearing down. Accompanying that theme of glory is the theme of God's judgment. It is complete in its scope. It affects both God's people and the surrounding nations. It affects the kingship, it affects the temple, it affects the land, and it affects the people. It is complete in its scope. All that the people of God knew must be renewed. But in the message of Ezekiel, that renewal only comes through painful destruction. And then the final sort of theme to be aware of, so glory and judgment, would then the third would be renewal. I've already mentioned it a little bit. Remember in chapter 37, there is this great picture of Ezekiel and the dry bones, the valley of dry bones. And Ezekiel witnesses this miracle. It really is a miracle of restoration of life, of resurrection to the dry bones. Ultimately, God's plans are to give life, to give sinews and muscles and flesh and breath to that which is dead. Restoration of all that has been polluted and corrupted is the ultimate message of Ezekiel. So we can't stop reading just with the judgment. We need to hear the hope for restoration. But we can't just read the restoration either. We also need to understand what has gone wrong in order to understand what will go right. In terms of a reading strategy, a reading plan, again, Ezekiel is a long writing, and we could devote a significant more amount of time than we will. And so what I recommend is a reading plan that gives you a sense of the whole, a sense of his message and his persona, a little bit of the judgment and the restoration that I've mentioned earlier. So first, read Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3, which concerns Ezekiel's call and his commissioning. Then read Ezekiel chapters 4 and 5. This will give you just a sense of Ezekiel's embodied show and tell message. Then I invite you to read a little selectively from the middle. So read chapters 10 through 12, chapter 14, chapter 18, and chapter 24. I know, hopping around a little bit. But this will give you a sense of the departure of God's glory, God's judgment, and the beginning of exile. Then read chapters 33 through 37. This is where we begin to see clearly the promised restoration that Ezekiel declares. And then conclude with chapter 43, which is where the glory of God returns. You could read chapters 44 through 48. It is the picture of the new temple. It is sometimes spoken of in excruciating detail, but it's there and it's of interest as well. As you read these questions, I invite you to consider a few questions that the text of Ezekiel both answers and raises. First, why is Israel in exile? This is a perennial question to the literature of exile, but see how Ezekiel answers the question. Second, is God unjust? Or, to put it the other way, how is God just and justified in dealing with the people of God in this way? Third, what does restoration look like? If judgment looks like this, what does restoration look like? And finally, would a prophet like Ezekiel be welcome in your context, in your place of worship, or in your place of work, or in your neighborhood? If a contemporary Ezekiel came around today, what would we think? Ezekiel is a prophet who says that the new must be put in new things, and so the old must be done away with. There's a lot to think about, and I cannot wait to hear what you think. Happy reading.